This video covers how VM templates are onboarded into the Jamcracker platform. A VM template is a representation of an image, a system image that can have just an OS or an OS and additional software, like for example Apache or WordPress. And these VM templates are the objects that appear in the designer UI used to define app stacks. VM templates are onboarded at the SuperAdmin UI. When logged in at the SuperAdmin UI, navigate to the Orchestration Metadata tab, under which you see 8 subtabs. Configuring these allow the system to have a representation of an image that later appear in the design UI for app stacks. The boxes that you see here in these different categories are the system images that are the VM templates. To onboard these boxes, you use the SuperAdmin UI here under Orchestration Metadata to create the representation of the image. This UI is also going to be available in the Marketplace Administration UI. The process of onboarding a VM template requires multiple items to be configured. There are 4 steps involved in configuring the VM template. The first step is defining provider regions, component types, and resource types. Now, this step is usually not required. The Jamcracker platform has preceded information for all of these, especially the component types. Provider regions, some regions may not be available but can be configured if you wish. By default, 2 or 3 regions are available for a vendor like AWS. So let's take a look at what's available now in this system. Under provider regions, if you notice, for the service provider, there are 3 regions that are visible. Once these are configured, they appear to customers when they launch a stack. On the right side, when I select that vendor, the region drop-down gets populated with the values that was onboarded in the Orchestration Metadata Provider Regions section. So if you remember, there were 3 regions configured in the SuperAdmin Orchestration Metadata tab. Those 3 values will appear in the region drop-down. There we go. All right. Going back, component types are a categorization of a internal component required for the Jamcracker platform to represent the actual image. There is no additional task for a normal user to go to component types and configure a new component type, so we are going to skip that section. Resource types are categorizations of the objects of the VM templates. The 4 tabs that you see here in the designer UI, which is the UI that Marketplace administrators use to define a stack, these categories are the resource types. If you would like to create a new category, all you have to do is to go back to Orchestration Metadata, go to resource types, and add another resource type where you can upload the name and the logo that must appear there in that designer UI. So here we are going to see what the 4 categories that we saw in the designer UI. There we go, operating system, application, database, and scripts. And when you add a new resource type, you would type in the name and description that would finally appear in the designer UI, visible to the Marketplace administrator. There we go, name. Name is the name that appears in the UI here as you hover over it. The code is a unique internal short name for this resource categorization. It is unique. And then you just select default for default console and then upload the logo that will appear finally on the left side here. By default, there are 4 categories or 4 resource types. Operating system, which is just a category of simple VMs with just the OS. Application, which is a categorization of VM templates that contain an OS as well as an application software, like for example WordPress or Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Databases, MySQL and Postgres. And the last category is a special category that are not actually VM templates but scripts that can be run on VMs. This is a different type of resource which is by default available in the designer UI. Going back to the creation steps. So once that first step is done, which is usually not required, the most important part that has to be covered is to create the images and resources. Resources are the actual components that show up in the category. Once you create a resource, it appears as a box in one of these resource types. The resource itself, the box itself, must be mapped to an actual image in the provider. That is done by creating an object called image and then mapping it to what is called a provider image, both available in the orchestration metadata UI. So there we go, resources. Yeah, so you create resources here, give it a name, for example, MySQL, PostgreSQL, right? And when you add the resource, that's where you provide the logo that appears in the box that shows up in the designer UI. So this is the resource. And then creation of images, which is a representation of the actual image, the VM image that will actually be provisioned when that resource is actually provisioned. So here's a listing of images where you can state exactly what sort of image you're going to get. But this is just a logical representation of the image. The image must finally be associated with a provider image, which is an actual image in the provider systems. So you would just type in, say for example, HA proxy to create a representation of the HA proxy image. Give it a short name that is unique. Platform is the OS that it runs on. By default, these are the OS options that are available in the Jamcracker platform. These are not created in these UI tabs. They are already pre-built in the Jamcracker platform. The architecture of the image, 64-bit or 32-bit, and then select OS for type. Now, it is also possible that you may have to type in a few properties that store information related to the username and password that comes with those provider images. It may not be required to type it in here. It's usually done in the provider images section. So once you create this, you would go to provider images and map that image to actual images in each vendor. This means that there could be one-to-many mappings between one image and multiple provider image entries. For example, an entry that is HA proxy can be provisioned in AWS and Azure and OpenStack or even VMware, but all of them would have to have unique provider image codes that identify the specific image in that particular vendor. For example, this AMI code represents this particular image, Windows Server 2003 in AWS. Whereas Windows Server 2003 in Azure may have a very different looking image ID, provider ID. So here's how you do that. You click on Add Provider Image, select the service provider, the regions that were actually created under the provider regions. The JC image is the image that you created here. So let's say, for example, we select Windows Server 2003. This field, service provider image code, is where you type in the actual code. Secure properties is where you type in the username and password that JSTN can use to offer SSH and RDP functionality for this image when it is provisioned. This has to be provided in a JSON format. Please refer to the Jamcracker documentation for the actual format. So once the provider image is created and is mapped to that image when it was created, you're almost there. The last step that has to be done is to map the resource, which was the box that was created that will appear under the category in the designer UI, to the image that was created now. That is done through an internal logical group mapping with an additional object called a component, which is then mapped to the resource using another object called resource component, both available in the SuperAdmin UI. So let's take a look at components and add a component. This is where you type in the actual name of the component, which is just an internal mapping. The name that will appear in the launching screen when customers launch the actual image under the OS version, this is the name that you would provide under the image object. So the most important thing that you have to remember is that the name that you want users to see must be created in the image section. Components don't really have an impact. Here, when you create your component, you would give it a name. This is just a logical grouping. And then go to resource component and map the component you created to the image that was, the resource that was created. So let's go to resource component and see how that is mapped. So every time you have to map a object which is a resource here to the actual image that is going to be launched in the vendor. What you need to do is to map it between the OS type and another object called GVM, or a generic VM. I'll just show that here. So the first thing we'll do is select the category under which this particular resource is appearing. So there are 4 categories by default. Let's select operating system. And this is the resource names that are currently there, which is Windows, Linux, and GVM. If you just switch to the view here, Designer UI, there we go, the 3 resources that are created. If you created your own resource, they would appear here and would be listed here. So selecting one of the existing options here, let's say Linux, then map it to the actual component name. If you remember, this is the object that is created that maps between the image and the provider. So let's just go back to the diagram here. So you would create the resource, create the image and link it to a provider image, create the component, and then link the component and the resource in the resource component view. So this is how we do that. So you select the component name and the mapping is done. So this is how the actual image of a provider is mapped to a resource or a actual VM template that appears in the Designer UI. And once these options are saved in the SuperAdmin UI, they appear as a box here and then can be used when designing a template.